When any news program says, "On Wall Street today," the world listens, and listens closely. Trillions of dollars change hands on Wall Street each year, with a shout, a point, a scribble, and a touch of a keyboard. In the 1920s, financial journalist Edwin Lefebvre offered timeless advice to investors.
Nowhere does history indulge in repetition so often or so uniformly as in Wall Street. The game does not change, and neither does human nature.
For more than 200 years, men, and more recently women, have come to Wall Street to buy, sell, and haggle. They've not always done so politely, or sometimes even honestly. But in pursuing their own self-interest, they made Wall Street the greatest creator of wealth ever seen. I'm Sue Herrera, and this is The Great Game.
CNBC presents The Great Game, the story of Wall Street.
Our story begins here in New York Harbor. This is one of the greatest natural harbors in the world. In the 1620s, the Dutch, then one of the world's great superpowers, claimed it as their own. They founded a colony called New Amsterdam, on the island we still call Manhattan.
Many people who came to found American colonies in the 17th century came for religious reasons. The Puritans to New England, the Quakers to Pennsylvania, the Catholics to Maryland. But the Dutch came here for one reason only, and that was to make a buck. The Dutch were the most financially sophisticated people in Europe. They invented or developed most of the modern mechanisms of capitalism, such as insurance and stock markets.
Really, all the elements of modern financial capitalism centered around a profit-driven economy you see emerging in Holland in the 17th century. It is the cradle of modern capitalism.
Business flourished in New Amsterdam. It was a live and let live town based on commerce, where more than a dozen languages could be heard on the street. But the Dutch colony had enemies, their old rivals, the English. So Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch governor of New Amsterdam, built a 12-foot-high wooden wall on the town's northern border.
Well, the Dutch built the wall to protect themselves from the English colonies in New England, who were beginning to covet the magnificent harbor in which New Amsterdam was set, and they feared an invasion from those colonies.
The wall began on what is today a landmark of the financial district, the Trinity Churchyard, and stretched to the East River. But the wall failed.
In 1664, during the Anglo-Dutch War, unfortunately for Peter Stuyvesant, who was a soldier, not a sailor, the English did not invade over land. They sailed up through the Narrows with the British fleet and put the city under its guns. Peter Stuyvesant wanted to get down with all flags flying, but the local merchants, including his own son, convinced him that there was no point in losing the colony and their fortunes. They might just as well lose the colony and keep the fortunes. So they surrendered without a shot being fired.
The English renamed the town New York. The citizens adjusted quickly to the new government. Money, not politics, was the town's passion.
The Dutch ruled New York for only 40 years, and the English-speaking peoples have ruled it now for 330-odd. And many people think that there's not much of a Dutch inheritance in New York besides a few words like Brooklyn and cookie. But in fact, deep within this mighty metropolis, there still beats the heart of that little tiny, hustly, bustly, let's make a deal place that was New Amsterdam. And to this day, the making of money is still this city's greatest love.
As New York grew, the space behind the useless wall turned into a street, inevitably named Wall Street. At the foot of Wall Street, along the East River, was a prosperous market in wheat, fur, and slaves. But this growing economy was very primitive.
The English government did not allow banks to be set up. The money supply was chaotic, to put it mildly. There was very little British currency circulated in this country.
The most widely accepted currency was the Spanish milled coins called reales, better known as pieces of 8.
It was literally broken up into pieces of 8, and the tradition of stocks being traded in 8s at the New York Stock Exchange comes from this early currency.
If the economy in colonial New York was primitive, it was also prosperous. When Britain tried to collect more taxes from its colony, the colonists rebelled, declaring themselves independent of Britain and launching the Revolutionary War.
New York had a bad war. The British took the city in 1776, and shortly after they took over, the city burned. By the end, there were no standing trees, a lot of burned, ruined buildings. It was just pretty cramped and nasty.
After the Americans won the war, George Washington took his presidential oath of office in New York at the site of what is now Federal Hall, just across the street from the New York Stock Exchange. And even then, Washington recognized the bond between the financial machinery and the course of the nation.
There is no truth more thoroughly established than that there exists in the economy and course of human nature an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness, between duty and advantage, between the genuine maxims of an honest and magnanimous policy and the solid rewards of public prosperity and felicity.
One of Washington's first acts was to appoint Alexander Hamilton the first Secretary of the Treasury.
Making Hamilton the Treasury Secretary was a very smart move. What Hamilton had that very few other Americans had was a lifelong experience in a commercial milieu, because Hamilton had come from the Caribbean and he had been apprenticed as a clerk in a merchant house at the age of 9.
When Hamilton took over as Secretary of the Treasury, the economy was in chaos.
We were an economic basket case. We were a third world nation before the term had been invented. We talk about banana republics today. We were a maple republic. You know, that would be the word if we'd continued to go the way we were going.
But Hamilton had a plan, which he laid out in his Report for the Support of the Public Credit. Despite powerful opponents like Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton's idea for a strong central bank was adopted. It was called the Bank of the United States, and Hamilton came up with an ingenious way to finance it. The federal government would put up 20% of the bank's money, and the rest would come from private citizens who would buy shares in the bank, just as a company's shares are sold on Wall Street today.
The bank did very well. Its stock sold out immediately and it began selling quickly at a surplus because people expected it to be very profitable, which it was. This was a very hot stock. This was an IPO of major proportions.
Shares in the Bank of the United States became America's first hot stock, just as stocks for railroads and automobiles and internet companies would later. In fact, the frenzy for the bank created America's first bull market. But where do the familiar terms bull and bear come from?
The bear comes from the old English phrase to sell the bear's skin before the bear has been killed, which means selling something that you haven't in your possession.
There are 19th century explanations of the two terms that liken the behavior of the stock market traders to the behavior of the animals, in such that a bull will, with its horns, butt things upward, and a bear will reach into a tree and with its paw and pull things down.
Well, they use the terms stock and bonds interchangeably. And it was only after the Civil War, actually, that the two words separated completely in meaning, which has led to a great deal of confusion, not least among economic historians. Oh, in the very early days, Wall Street brokers were not just securities brokers. They dealt in insurance and lottery tickets and tontines and all sorts of different operations, because the financial market was so small that you couldn't make a living just trading securities in New York in the 1790s.
With the market in a frenzy, Hamilton put pressure on the buyers and sellers to make the market more stable, and he stated it in no uncertain terms.
"'Tis time there should be a line of separation between honest men and knaves, between respectable stockholders and dealers in the funds, and mere unprincipled gamblers."
On May 17, 1792, 24 of New York's most prominent brokers gave in and signed a pledge called the Buttonwood Agreement, after a buttonwood tree on Wall Street, where brokers often met to conduct business.
Basically, what they're doing was forming a cartel in which they pledged to trade with each other before trading with anybody else and to not charge less than a certain commission.
It was a very simple document. Not much structure or regulation was associated with it yet, but it was the beginnings of the New York Stock Exchange.
But some people, like Aaron Burr, found other ways to get ahead in business. In 1799, 5 years before he killed Alexander Hamilton in their famous duel, Burr made a proposal to the New York State Legislature, a company to bring badly needed fresh water to Manhattan. But his real intention was very different.
The Manhattan Water Company was a scheme of Aaron Burr's. He wanted to charter a bank, but he didn't want to seem to charter a bank, because then people would say, well, why are you doing this? What's your end in view? Nobody notices this. He proposes it at the end of the session, and it kind of gets rammed through at the last minute.
The result was a bank controlled by Burr. Today, that bank is one of the largest and most reputable in the country.
The water company didn't supply much water for very long, but the bank's still around. It's Chase Manhattan.
Soon, Wall Street would see many other artful deceptions. When we come back, how Wall Street money won the West, and the invention of what's been called the Victorian Internet. In the early years of the 19th century, Wall Street showed off its growing maturity by creating its first formal stock exchange, called the New York Stock and Exchange Board.
The stock market had grown enough, there were new securities issued by 1817 that a more formalized organization was required. So the 32 brokers came together and created a constitution which was essentially rules for the conduct of stock trading.
But a broker back then would find it very hard to imagine how powerful Wall Street would become.
I mean, on the international financial scheme, New York was a backwater of no importance whatever. It hardly ranked at all. It almost might as well have been located on the back of the moon in terms of its financial power.
At the beginning of the 19th century, Wall Street wasn't even the financial capital of America. Philadelphia was.
Philadelphia actually established a proper stock exchange in 1792, 25 years before New York did.
New York obviously was a very ambitious city, but Philadelphia then was the financial capital, and you might have thought it would continue to be so.
Philadelphia might very well have remained the financial capital, except for circumstances and luck, which is a very handy attribute.
Wall Street got a lucky break hundreds of miles away from Manhattan in upstate New York, the Erie Canal. The canal was a breathtaking accomplishment, a 363-mile-long trench dug by hand to exploit a gap in the Appalachian Mountains, an enormous barrier that cut off the rich farmlands of the western frontier from the cities on the East Coast. Once it was built, the canal funneled trade straight to Manhattan.
The Erie Canal was an instant success. It started paying its way long before the canal was finished. But as soon as it was finished, the commerce on it was beyond anybody's wildest imagination. And New York City began to grow by leaps and bounds. It became the greatest boom town the world has ever known.
Soon, another new development was turning heads on Wall Street. the railroad.
As with most new technologies, investors loved railroads at the beginning because there was all the sunny promise and none of the ugly realities, because none of the railroads had run a railroad yet. And so there was a great boom in railroad stocks in the 1830s.
The railroad proved itself quickly, and railroads began spreading like a spider web across the United States.
It's hard to imagine modern America without what the railroads were in the 19th century, because not only did it physically stitch the country together as one economic and geographical unit, but it created the modern financial markets. In order to raise money for the railroads, the banking system developed and the sales of securities developed in a way that we're still operating out of the fundamental principles that were set up.
A journalist of the time described the powerful effects of the railroad on Wall Street.
The mania seemed to possess everybody. Old-fashioned merchants abandoned the principles of a lifetime and took a flyer, or in other words, bought a few hundred shares of Erie. Even the fair sex, practically asserting women's rights under the cover of a broker, dabbled in Erie shares.
Well, the railroads just came to dominate the entire U.S. stock market by the middle of the 19th century onwards. Was mainly a railroad market. The other stuff was peripheral.
In 1844, the first great revolution in communications hit Wall Street, those simple dots and dashes of the telegraph. It's hard to imagine today just how primitive communication was then.
Well, a financial market can never be larger than the area within which communication is effectively instant, because everybody in the market has to know what the current prices are.
Outside Manhattan, the demand for the latest Wall Street information led to some bizarre schemes.
That so anxious were people to get current prices that they actually established a semaphore line between New York and Philadelphia.
They positioned people every 6 to 8 miles on tall buildings or hilltops with a telescope and a semaphore flag, and someone from the merchants atop the Merchants Exchange would begin with the list and using various configurations of the flag, transmit the prices to the next person stationed in Jersey City, and so on, all the way to Philadelphia. And that way the market news could reach Philadelphia in about 30 minutes.
But the telegraph cut that time to seconds.
The telegraph was immediately important because it could convey information at the speed of light over vast distances. And therefore people who had used to trade in Boston or Philadelphia or Baltimore could now trade in New York and get better prices. And so Wall Street very quickly, within 10 years, became not only the largest financial securities market in the United States, but essentially the only one.
Side by side, the telegraph and the railroads were opening the vast American West, and Wall Street was financing it.
Well, it appeals to investors because potentially it can all be settled. Then if it's settled, people have to be able to get there, and people have to be able to send their goods to market. Well, who's going to pay for it? Wall Street is going to pay for it, and Wall Street is going to profit by paying for it. You know, they're the ones who have the capital to open this all up in the hopes that they will reap the rewards.
Soon, Wall Street received more good news about the American West: gold in California. By 1849, word of the gold strike reached the East Coast.
The reaction was essentially a riot. I mean, 80,000 people left the eastern seaboard and traveled to California, and the same number the following year. It affected Wall Street by adding enormously to the American money supply, because in the mid-19th century, the money supply was defined by gold. I mean, the world was essentially on the gold standard since the Bank of England had gone on that standard in 1821.
But Wall Street's great booms were followed by devastating busts. It was a cycle that afflicted the economy for the entire 19th century. Investor George Francis Train offered this wry comment on the wild speculation brought about by the new technologies.
Monday, I started my land operations. Tuesday, owed millions by all calculations. Wednesday, my brownstone palace began. Thursday, I drove out a spanking new Span. Friday, I gave a magnificent ball. Saturday, smashed with just nothing at all.
The U.S. was the emerging market of the 19th century. It's hard to remember that now because we're so used to America being so much the dominant economic power in the world, but it was very fragile at that time, the economy, and the gyrations that Wall Street went through with wild speculation, terrible bankruptcies, panics, depressions, and crashes. It was really cowboy capitalism. It was completely chaotic. There were hucksters under every tree, and the honest businessmen and good railroads were hard to find.
Soon, America would have a much more agonizing problem as the country tore itself apart. When we come back, the Civil War on Wall Street and the golden age of stock manipulators.
The only rule on Wall Street in the Civil War era was caveat emptor, let the buyer beware.
Wars, according to an old Chinese saying, are fought with silver bullets. Strategy and men win individual battles, but final victory goes to the side that better turns its wealth to military purpose.
At the outbreak of the Civil War, the stock market plunged, but it soon recovered.
When the war broke out in April of 1861, what happened on Wall Street is what usually happens in a financial market when war is declared. They panicked. And the market was in turmoil for several months until it was determined that the war was going to be very long and very expensive, and the bonds the federal government was going to have to sell to finance the war were going to have to be traded in Wall Street. At that point, one of the great bull markets in Wall Street history erupted.
In the war's first year alone, the Union government's expenses grew from $172,000 a day to $1 million a day. The money went to railroads, iron mills, textile manufacturers, and munitions companies.
The government was selling bonds to raise money for the war effort, and that helped also create more dimensions of the modern markets as bankers had to sort of underwrite those securities.
But even as Washington financed the boom on Wall Street, profit often mattered more than patriotism.
When the Union does well, the market crashes in Wall Street, and when the Union does badly, Wall Street thrives. And so you have the people, whistling Dixie in the gold room because they want gold to go up, and they want the Union to lose battles, if not the war.
This was all done in a very cold-blooded fashion. Whoever won, whoever lost, that wasn't the point. It was what the effect of this was going to be on gold.
President Lincoln was furious and expressed his rage in public.
As for these speculators, I wish every one of them would have his devilish head shot off.
Wall Street learned the outcome of the Battle of Gettysburg before Abraham Lincoln did. Their sources of information were that good.
As trading surged, the old guard brokers tried to keep up. But other Wall Street players saw their chance to cash in on the Civil War boom. New, freewheeling exchanges opened all over New York.
It was a frenzy. The trading went on not only on the stock exchange, but the trading on Broad Street, the so-called curb market, was larger than it had ever been before. In the evenings, they had uptown exchanges in hotels where they carry on stock trading.
There was just a mass of speculation occurring everywhere. I mean, it was the first great period of mass speculation in American history.
Brokers could earn up to $10,000 a day in commissions, and some spent it just as quickly. The Gilded Age, the title of Mark Twain's novel about this era of opulence, was in full swing, and Delmonico's was the restaurant of the day.
One of the most fun evenings at Delmonico's would be a diamond dinner. And the reason they were called diamond dinners is female guests would receive diamond bracelets, and the male guests would receive cigars wrapped in $100 bills at the end of the meal, and this was your party favor.
The Civil War boom had transformed Wall Street. Where there had been millions in play, suddenly there were billions. In just 3 years, it had become second only to London as a world financial power. Author James K. Medberry offered this comment on the richness and excess of the times.
New York never exhibited such widespread evidences of prosperity. Broadway was lined with carriages. The fashionable milliners, dressmakers, and jewelers reaped golden harvests. Anonymous startled the city with the splendor of her robes and the luxury of her equipage. Vanity Fair was no longer a dream.
Before the Civil War, Wall Street was a very small place. Virtually everybody knew everybody. And the rules of the game could be enforced the same way the rules of a backyard touch football game are enforced, just by peer pressure. But when the Civil War came along, Wall Street suddenly found itself the second largest securities market in the world, and there were no new rules. The only rule on Wall Street in the Civil War era was caveat emptor, let the buyer beware.
This new game was perfectly suited for two men who made the most remarkable team in Wall Street history, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk.
I think Gould and Fisk are the most comic pair of speculators that one's ever seen in history, because there was Fisk, all ebullient and lavishly dressed and pomaded with little ringlets and fancy gloves, and he used to wear fancy uniforms. He's rather like something out of the opera. And there was Gould, a sort of sinister, dark, choleric figure. Gould is distrustful, dishonest, breaks everyone he comes into conflict with.
In 1857, they became partners in an epic Wall Street fight, the battle for the Erie Railroad.
It became the greatest speculative football in the history of Wall Street. In fact, so much so that it was called the Scarlet Woman of Wall Street because it broke the hearts of so many investors.
Gould and Fisk joined forces with the thoroughly unscrupulous Wall Street legend Daniel Drew. Drew had made himself treasurer of the Erie and used the railroad stock to his own ends.
Drew's principal interest in the Erie Railway was making money out of the securities by manipulating them. And even though he was treasurer of the railway for many years and served on its board of directors for even longer, he was known as a speculative director because he had no hesitation whatsoever to manipulate the stock at the expense of the other stockholders.
Together, the three milked Erie stock shamelessly. But a powerful opponent also wanted control of the Erie. Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore, one of the richest men of his time. Vanderbilt wanted to add the Erie to his own railroad empire. But he knew the railroad would never be honest with Drew, Fisk, and Gould in charge. So the Commodore decided to gain control by buying up Erie's stock with his enormous wealth. But the three speculators laid a trap for the Commodore.
Drew, Fisk, and Gould had a secret weapon called a printing press. They simply printed more and more stock as the Commodore bought more and more stock.
Eventually, the Commodore caught wind of their scheme. He went straight to a judge he had bribed and demanded the three be arrested. The judge did as he was told, but the three were one step ahead of the Commodore.
Once they found out that the sheriff was after them, immediately skedaddled across the Hudson River in a rowboat. Very nearly drowned, by the way, but they managed to get across to New Jersey with $7 million of the Commodore's money in cash in a carpet bag.
The fight continued in the courts and the state legislature. And when the dust settled, the Commodore got his money back, Gould and Fisk got the railroad, and the Erie stockholders got the bill.
Just as the Erie battles were ending, Wall Street got a vital new piece of technology, the stock ticker.
The stock ticker had transformed Wall Street itself just as the telegraph had transformed the United States financial securities market, because it allowed instant communication of prices from the floor to almost anywhere within reach of a telegraph.
But technological innovations didn't end some of the old ways of getting ahead on Wall Street. In 1868, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk hatched another scheme. They would corner the gold market.
Gold was absolutely central to the world's financial system. Since 1821, the Bank of England had been on the gold standard, which meant that it would buy or sell unlimited quantities of pounds sterling for gold at a set rate. All other major trading countries had to be on the gold standard as well in order to finance international trade.
Gould knew if he and Fisk could corner the gold available in New York, they could dictate the price of gold, at least for a while, and make tens of millions of dollars. But Gould had to be certain the government wouldn't interfere.
Gould realized that the only way he could affect his scheme was if the United States government stayed neutral, because the United States government had enough gold to break any corner.
So Fisk and Gould went to the top, bribing President Grant's brother-in-law. The president had to be convinced not to sell gold. Confident that the government would stay out of the gold market, Fisk and Gould bought up enormous amounts of gold. Their scheme forced prices so high that many brokers now faced ruin. On September 24, 1869, Wall Street's anxiety over gold turned into a full-blown panic. Prices were rising every minute, seemingly without end. It was a day known forever after as Black Friday. E.C. Stedman, known as the Poet Laureate of Wall Street, provided this ode to the panic created by Fisk and Gould.
Zounds, how the price went flashing through Wall Street. William Broad Street knew all the specie in the land, held in one ring by a giant hand. For millions more, it was ready to pay and throttle the street on Hangman's Day. Up from the gold pit's nether hell, while the innocent fountain rose and fell. Loud and higher the bidding rose, and the bulls triumphant faced their foes. It seems as if Satan himself were in it, lifting it 1% a minute.
The morning of Friday, September 24th, 1869 was probably the most exciting day in the history of Wall Street. I mean, Wall Street and Broad were packed with people screaming and yelling. The gold room, you could hardly move, so many people were in there. And so many of these people saw ruin staring them in the face because many of them were, in the ordinary course of their business, short of gold. And if gold was cornered, they were ruined.
Outside the exchange, thousands of anxious men crowded the streets, screaming as the price of gold went higher. An observer at the time said it looked as if the inmates of a dozen lunatic asylums had been turned loose. But at 11:40 a.m., one highly respected broker decided he'd had enough.
Jim Fisk's broker, Albert Speyer, was screaming that he would buy $5 million in gold at 160. Suddenly, one of the brokers shouted, "Sold." He was going to take that gold at 160. And at that point, the panic instantly broke. It was like a slap across the face of an hysteric.
A journalist from the New York Herald describes the scene in painful detail.
For the rest of the day, Wall Street was like the vicinity of a great fire or calamity after the climax had passed. A sudden quiet and calm came over the scene. The brokers, hoarse with shouting earlier in the day, were gathered in groups, comparing notes and talking in subdued tones. Each few minutes, the hammer of the presiding officer called the assemblage to order, and gold was bought or sold, under the rule, for the account of some defaulting bull or bear.
The mess left by the panic was largely swept under the rug. Gould and Fisk were never prosecuted. As it turned out, trying to corner the gold market was not illegal. Gould went on to make millions on other deals. But just 3 years after the gold scheme collapsed, Fisk was shot to death in a rivalry over a woman.
From the horrors of the Civil War, Wall Street had become one of the world's great financial centers in just a few years. It had now outgrown its financial infancy, but would it survive its wild adolescence? When we return, the age of invention, how Wall Street made science fiction come true, and the woman known as the Witch of Wall Street. Wall Street had grown faster than any financial marketplace in history. Now, after a decade of frenzied trading, fly-by-night schemes, and overnight fortunes and bankruptcies, Wall Street wanted stability.
The brokers on Wall Street made their living, as they still do, by taking small commissions on every trade. And therefore, the more trades there are, the more commissions there are, and the better off the brokers are. The speculators made their money from one big coup, and they didn't much care what was left after they made their one big coup. I mean, so the brokers had a different interest than the speculators. But during the early 1860s, there was anarchy on Wall Street because there was no dominant organization. The New York Stock and Exchange Board, which became the New York Stock Exchange in 1863, was too small to impose order.
In 1869, the New York Stock Exchange merged with the Open Board, the largest of the new exchanges that had sprung up during the Civil War.
There were now referees in this Super Bowl, and therefore the game was a much more honest game and a much more predictable game. Investors didn't have to worry about being fleeced. It wasn't that Wall Street was risk-free by any manner of means.
One of the most recognizable figures on this new Wall Street was Hetty Green. Though she wasn't a broker herself, she was a ruthless market operator.
Hetty Green's nickname was the Wicked Witch of Wall Street. And how she got it was, first of all, by being female. Of the 40 richest Americans who have ever lived, Hetty Green is the only woman to have made her own fortune and make that list.
She was also one of the world's great misers, employing a simple philosophy.
I don't much believe in stocks. I never buy industrials. Railroads and real estate are the things I like. There's no great secret in fortune making. All you have to do is buy cheap and sell dear. Act with thrift and shrewdness, and be persistent.
She lived quite a simple life in a small apartment. When her son was injured, she refused for him to see a doctor because she felt the doctor was too expensive, and he ended up losing his leg as a result of that missed trip to the doctors.
She seldom wore new clothes, and which gave her a witch-like appearance in her old black dress that was almost green with age. She would never have an office in New York because she was afraid of being taxed. And so she would go to the chemical bank where she kept her money and would sit at an empty desk, or if there were no empty desks, she would sit on the floor.
But as Hetty prospered, Wall Street's great Civil War rise came to an abrupt end.
After the Civil War, the railroads began expanding even faster than they had before the Civil War. They would also play games with each other. They would build competing railroads in another railroad's territory solely for the purpose of being bought out.
Some major lines racked up huge losses, taking investors and big banks with them. In September 1873, in an attempt to stop the freefall, the New York Stock Exchange announced it would close for a few days for the first time ever. It didn't help. The country suffered through 6 long years of depression.
Wall Street matured during this time. The last quarter of the 19th century was an era of technological marvels, and Wall Street led the way.
Both the electric light and the telephone were developed in the late 1870s. The telephone was taken to Wall Street very early because, again, it was a step up in communications, and the better the communications, the better the financial market.
In 1878, Wall Street installed the first telephones, just 2 years after Alexander Graham Bell proved his new invention worked. Wall Street also loved Thomas Edison's new electric light.
It transformed the experience of daily life. It went so fast. This is all happening within a matter of 2 decades, and it took people's breath away. I think it was, for the people who were on the cutting edge of it, it was thrilling, but for most other people, it was interesting, baffling, and somewhat terrifying. It made many people rich. It was a revolution in society, not unlike the technology of today.
Edison also vastly improved the stock ticker, updating the 1860s design into the icon seen in movies ever since. By 1886, Wall Street was riding high again. For the first time, 1 million shares were traded in a single day. A journalist's description of Wall Street players at the time sounds just as true today.
As a rule, the stockbrokers are a self-indulgent, genial, expansive, and generous class of fellow citizens. They dine well, dress well, bubble over with animal spirits, bear privately the reverses of fortune, and enjoy robust health.
But Wall Street and the larger economy were still plagued by wild swings between boom and bust.
Well, America started off the 19th century as a country of peasants. It was a country of farmers. And by the end of the 19th century, it's one of the premier industrial nations in the world. It's on a par with Britain, it's on a par with Germany. So that's a total shift.
The change made the economy vulnerable to terrible downturns. One of the worst hit in 1893.
The Depression of 1893 was one of the worst in American history. Banks failed, railroads went bankrupt, factories and mills closed, workers were thrown out of work, or their wages were seriously cut back. The railroads were a hugely important part of it. I think by 1898, 5 years into the Depression, a third of the railroad track mileage in this country was in foreclosure. The railroads employed more people than the U.S. Postal Service or the U.S. military service. And the bonded debt of the railroads was greater than the debt of the U.S. Treasury, so it had a huge impact on the national economy.
One of the biggest problems for investors? A lack of information.
Most cases, the company didn't feel obligated to tell the investor anything. Many times they simply refuse, saying we don't give out that information.
In 1895, the New York Stock Exchange demanded that all companies traded on the exchange issue annual reports. A year later, in 1896, journalist Charles Dow invented the very emblem of Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrial Average.
Charles Dow had a very good idea in the early 1890s, which was to provide an index to measure how the stock market performed on any given day and over time. And he did this by selecting at first 12 industrial stocks, later it was raised to 30, and he would add up their prices and divide by 12, and that would give you an idea of how the stock market had performed that day. And this was started in 1896, and today the Dow Jones Industrial Average is the oldest established stock market index in the world.
In 1896, the Dow started at 40.94. Since then, it's gone generally upward into the stratosphere of the 1990s bull market. In 1899, many people were optimistic about the future. As the year drew to a close, Wall Street brokers staged a boxing match between a man dressed as a bull and one dressed as a bear. Not surprisingly, the bull won. When we come back, how J.P. Morgan almost single-handedly saved Wall Street.
No modern figure in the late 20th century could have anywhere near the kind of power that Pierpont Morgan wielded at the turn of the last century.
And the coming of the American century, how Wall Street triumphed during the war to end all wars. As the 20th century began, America's future looked bright. The terrible depressions of the 1890s had been replaced by prosperity, and Wall Street was booming. In 1906, the Dow crossed 100 for the first time.
A broker of the time described Wall Street's high spirits.
From every lip dropped stories of fortunes gained in a week by this and that lucky stroke.
Many people were opposed to the rich money men, such as Andrew Carnegie, the steel tycoon, and John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil, the richest man in the world. But Wall Street was now an icon of popular culture, showing up in everything from toys to songs to cigars and musicals. The New York Stock Exchange needed more room for the surge in trading. Famed architect George Post designed a grand and beautiful new space. When it opened in 1903, the public was amazed.
It was much larger than the old building had been and was much more technologically up to date. I mean, there were 500 telephones around the edge of the trading floor to allow brokers to communicate with their offices quickly. And it was simply a much more efficient operation than it had been before because it was a building large enough to hold it. The trading floor remains to this day one of the great interior spaces of New York.
There was even an elaborate system for paging individual brokers called the Annunciator Board. Outside the exchange, the curbstone brokers were doing big business as well.
There were some interior offices on Broad Street, and there would be traders out on the street signaling up to the top windows, and you'd see traders in the outside windows signaling back down and hands up in the air with scraps of paper, sort of passing their trades up to these brokers in the windows.
Fueling Wall Street's boom was the consolidation of American industries into giant conglomerates known as trusts.
Trusts, as they were called in the 19th century, were essentially monopolies. They were attempts by various businesses to take control of the entire industry.
There were trusts in sugar and rubber, in rope, in copper. The largest trust of all was the United States Steel Corporation, which controlled about 45% of the American steel industry to begin with.
But many Americans hated the trusts.
These men were able to purchase enormous amounts of political power and to do pretty much whatever they wanted without much government regulation.
One of their most outspoken critics was President Theodore Roosevelt, who called the trust bosses the malefactors of wealth.
Theodore Roosevelt, even though he was considered the trust buster, sort of knew that the Wall Street financiers weren't hurt when trusts were broken up. In fact, he said in one of his campaign speeches, Wall Street's prayer is, "Oh, merciful Providence, please give us another dissolution." Really, the shareholder wasn't affected by the breakup of a company.
The financier who took much of the heat was J.P. Morgan, the guiding force behind many of the trusts, and an awesome and intimidating figure. The photographer Edward Steichen compared meeting his piercing gaze with confronting the headlights of an oncoming train.
If one could step off the tracks, they were merely awe-inspiring. If one could not, they were terrifying.
No modern figure in the late 20th century could have anywhere near the kind of power that Pierpont Morgan wielded at the turn of the last century. The jobs he was doing are now being done more or less by Alan Greenspan, Robert Rubin until recently, the IMF, the World Bank, Warren Buffett, and George Soros.
At the height of J.P. Morgan's career, it was said that merely to be seen walking down the front steps of the Morgan Bank with J.P. Morgan was enough to make a man's career.
Morgan firmly believed consolidation helped the economy by improving efficiency and ending cutthroat competition that bankrupted companies. But his critics thought his motives were greed and power. Wall Street paid little attention to the trust critics as the market grew, but booms often nurture the seed of their own destruction. In 1907, what started as a bank crisis spread among Wall Street's nervous investors.
The 1907 panic had a variety of causes. One of them was that we had an absolutely antiquated banking system in this country that had been devised for the pre-Civil War agrarian economy. It wasn't at all ready to handle a modern industrial financial system. The actual trigger in the United States was a copper speculation that failed, and that it was just the match that lit this tinderbox on fire.
In those days, before the FDIC and other reforms of the 1930s, if your bank failed, you lost all the money you had in it. You know, your life savings could simply disappear.
As the crisis threatened to topple one bank after another, J.P. Morgan took charge.
Morgan came to New York and appointed a team of younger men to do research for him about which banks were in good shape. And when they found one that seemed to be in very sound shape, it was just threatened by having the depositors all want their money back, he said, this is the place to stop the panic. He then called in the older bankers, and they essentially raised millions of dollars to supply to this trust company so that it could stay afloat. It could meet its depositors' demands and not fold in the midst of this crisis.
At the height of the panic of 1907, the president of the New York Stock Exchange walked across Broad Street to Morgan's office and told him the exchange would have to close to prevent brokers from failing.
Morgan flatly forbade it to do so and raised $27 million in about 15 minutes flat to provide the liquidity needed to keep the stock exchange open.
Toward the very end of the 3 weeks of this panic, Morgan calls all the presidents of the major banks who were in trouble into his private library on 36th Street, which is filled with Gutenberg Bibles and Renaissance Madonnas.
Morgan sat in the West Room, his office, before the fireplace, playing endless games of solitaire and smoking cigars despite a bad cold. Morgan's private secretary, Belle Green, came in.
Why don't you tell them what to do, Mr. Morgan?
I don't know what to do myself, but sometime someone will come in with a plan that I know will work, and then I will tell them what to do.
Morgan has locked the door, and nobody is going to leave this building until they come to a solution to the crisis. And by 4 o'clock in the morning, Morgan drafts a statement, takes it into the trust company presidents and says, this is what you're going to do, here's the statement, and here's a pen, sign it. One of his strengths in his entire career was his decisiveness. He was a man of action.
Theodore Roosevelt, who had blasted Morgan and his colleagues, now praised those conservative and substantial businessmen who, in this crisis, acted with such wisdom and public spirit. In the panic's aftermath, it was clear the U.S. needed a lender of last resort, an institution strong enough that it could take instant action in a financial crisis. That institution, the Federal Reserve, was established in 1913. J.P. Morgan died the same year.
Morgan's death provoked an extraordinary reaction for a private individual who had never held public office. Within 24 hours, over 5,000 telegrams poured into the hotel in Rome where he had died, including telegrams from the Pope and the Emperor of Germany and the King of England. And his body was brought back to New York, and there was a huge funeral at St. George's Church where he had faithfully attended for many, many years.
So when his estate was probated and it was figured out that he was worth about $80 million, people were astonished. That wasn't nearly as much money as they thought Morgan had. Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller and several other people were worth a lot more money. And supposedly, Rockefeller, reading about Morgan's net worth in the New York Times, shook his head and said, and to think he wasn't even a rich man.
But soon, Wall Street had another crisis to worry about. A war of unimaginable size was breaking out in Europe. Stock markets around the world were closing. On Wall Street, prices were crashing. In 1914, the New York Stock Exchange stopped trading for 4.5 months. But as the fighting turned into the drawn-out agony of trench warfare, Wall Street made a startling discovery.
It was thought that the American economy would suffer from a European war because the Europeans would begin repatriating their gold, and that this would drain the American financial system of its money supply. In fact, exactly the opposite happened, and the European gold began to flow into this country, where it has been ever since. It resides mostly in the vaults 85 feet below the Federal Reserve Bank on Liberty Street in downtown Manhattan.
America was also the only place that could now meet the Allies' endless demand for munitions, vehicles, and ships. During the war boom, a share of Bethlehem steel went from 46 1/8 to 459 1/2 and reached as high as 600. General Motors, already one of the country's biggest automobile manufacturers, started the war at 39. 6 months later, it was 81 1/2, and a year later, 500. When America entered the war in 1917, the economy got even hotter, and a huge new market developed on Wall Street, the Liberty Bond, to finance America's role in the war.
Liberty bonds were sold to ordinary people. You could buy them in very small denominations. And they were sold by people like Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford. They would hold bond rallies, and people would come by the thousands to see this new invention called movie stars. Americans learned from the Liberty Bond drives that there were other places to put their money besides mattresses, places where they could actually earn money. And so the number of investors increased thanks to the Liberty Bond drives.
On November 11th, 1918, the war officially ended. Wall Street gave the returning troops its highest honor, a ticker tape parade. But America was the only real victor of the war. Much of Europe lay in ruins. The dollar was now the international medium of exchange, replacing the British pound. America was now the undisputed financial and industrial leader of the world.
On the day that the British cabinet decided to declare war on Germany in August of 1914, the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, said that the lights are going out all over Europe. We will not see them lit again in our lifetime. And in fact, they have not been relit yet in an economic sense.
The American century had begun in earnest. When we come back, the Roaring '20s, Wall Street's meteoric rise and crash, and the New York Stock Exchange president who literally embezzled from widows and orphans. Wall Street's most famous decade, the Roaring '20s, literally started with a bang.
On September 16, 1920, a horse-drawn wagon, still a common sight in New York, stops at the famous corner of Wall and Broad Streets, the home of the J.P. Morgan Bank, the New York Stock Exchange, and Federal Hall. It is just a few minutes before noon. Moments later, the wagon explodes. 500 pounds of cut-up iron had been packed around explosives. The metal fragments into deadly shrapnel, killing 30 people instantly. 130 are injured. Inside the stock exchange, the huge windows of the trading floor are blown out. At the Morgan Bank, steel grates are ripped from the window, killing one worker instantly. Even today, inch-deep gouges on the bank's exterior can still be seen.
People speculated that the perpetrator were anarchists or Bolsheviks or other radicals, but in fact the police never found the perpetrator. It's still a mystery.
Wall Street bounced back quickly. After a short downturn when World War I ended, the economy started growing by leaps and bounds. The Roaring '20s were in full swing. A 1956 NBC News special, Project 20, The Jazz Age, described the spirit of the times.
From Boston to San Francisco, the bull market is the national mania, the biggest news of the day. Every day, coast to coast. Everything up, up, up. Don't sell America short. Why, man, we've scarcely started.
Per capita income increased by more than a third in the 20s. Spending soared as inflation stayed flat.
Consumer goods became a very important part of the American economy. Things like refrigerators, radios, especially automobiles, which became the dominant industry in the American economy. And people could buy these often on time, which was another new phenomenon.
In 1914, there were only about 1 million cars in America. By 1929, the country was producing more than 5.5 million a year, almost as many as were produced in the 1950s. For investors, it was a dream come true. Anyone who bought $25,000 worth of GM stock in 1921 and held it until 1929 was a millionaire.
Automobiles became the central industry of the United States in the 1920s. Because they affected so many other industries. I mean, the more automobiles were sold meant the more steel was sold, the more rubber was sold, the more glass was sold.
People are buying on credit. They are able to make payments for their stove, and sort of the American dream is being lived out by many, many people. They're also buying stock on credit, and this will come back and haunt a lot of people in 1929.
As the American economy did well, Wall Street did even better. The Dow Jones Industrial Average quadrupled during the decade as Wall Street issued thousands of new offerings. Glamour stocks had unbelievable rides, like the new Radio Corporation of America, better known as RCA.
The rise of RCA stock in the 1920s, thanks to the radio, and the rise of internet stocks today, thanks to the internet, they're very similar. I mean, you have this new technology with unknown potentialities, and so dreams are easy and the realities are small. And so people tend to rush in, and some of them make a great deal of money, and some of them do not.
From 1923 to 1929, RCA's price rose 30-fold. In 1928 alone, the price went from $85 to $420 a share, even though the company had never paid a dividend. People from every walk of life got in on the action, as was noted in a whimsical poem in the Saturday Evening Post.
Oh, hush thee, my babe, Granny's bought some more shares. Daddy's gone out to play with the bulls and the bears. Mother's buying on tips and she simply can't lose. And baby shall have some expensive new shoes.
Brokerages sprang up around the country, and Wall Street struggled to keep up with this huge growth. The New York Stock Exchange installed more efficient trading posts on the floor, shaped like horseshoes. The curb brokers made an even more radical change. They came indoors to create what became known as the American Stock Exchange. Wall Street was pouring its enormous wealth into an unprecedented construction boom. Success was creating Manhattan's unmistakable skyline. But the market was losing touch with reality.
By 1928, there were clear signs the economy was beginning to slow down. Agriculture, which had been in recession for most of the decade and had been getting worse and worse. Rural banks were failing, and this was putting pressure on city banks. The Federal Reserve was raising interest rates in order to slow down the economy because Wall Street was becoming guilty of irrational exuberance.
Wall Street was now in a world of its own as prices kept rising. On September 2nd, the Dow reached a record high of 381.17. The market would not see such heights again for 25 years. What we now know as the crash of 1929 occurred over a 6-day period, beginning October 24th, Black Thursday.
When the market opened on October 24th, 1929, an avalanche of sell orders hit the floor, and prices just plunged and plunged and plunged, and some of the floor traders began shorting stock, which put further pressure on the market. Brokers began sending out margin calls because people's collateral had fallen below their obligations, and when these margin calls were not met, this stock was dumped on the market, and the market was in free fall until around 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
By noon, paper losses reached $9.5 billion. Anxious crowds filled the street outside the exchange. The Morgan Bank tried to help, just as it had in the panic of 1907.
There had been a meeting of bankers in the Morgan Bank, and they had put up a fund to steady the market. And the acting president of the New York Stock Exchange went to the post where U.S. Steel was traded, and he said, "I bid 205 for 10,000 shares of U.S. Steel." He then went from post to post buying blue chip stocks, and immediately the market strengthened. Shorts began to close out their positions, and the market actually in many cases showed a slight rise for the day.
The panic slowed as word spread of the bankers' attempt to prop up prices. Workers struggled all night to process the day's record-breaking volume of 13 million shares traded. The next day, Friday, stocks rallied, and some thought the worst might be over. But by Monday, the market dropped again as rumors spread that brokers were committing suicide. As the panic worsened, the New York Times tried to reassure its readers. From the opening bell on Tuesday, October 29th, there was no stopping the avalanche. Prices plummeted. Everyone, from maids to bankers, was forced to sell. Wall Street was completely undone.
The New York Stock Exchange had rather strict rules of decorum, people not being allowed to shout or run around. But this day the rules were completely flouted. People ran around, grabbed each other, their collars were pulled off, and so on. It was just a wild panic.
In just 2 days, the Dow had lost more than 22% of its value, wiping out many investors. Historians and economists still debate whether the crash caused the Great Depression or was a symptom of a larger problem in the economy. But there is no question it was the worst American economic calamity of the 20th century. A New York Times journalist offered this poignant account of the aftermath.
Groups of men, with sometimes a woman, stood about inverted glass bowls all over the city yesterday, watching spools of ticker tape unwind. And as the tenuous paper with its cryptic numerals grew longer at their feet, their fortunes shrunk. The crowds about the ticker tapes, like friends about the bedside of a stricken family, reflected in their faces the story the tape was telling. There were no smiles. There were no tears either. Just the camaraderie of fellow sufferers. Everybody wanted to tell his neighbor how much he had lost. Nobody wanted to listen. It was too repetitious a tale.
In Washington, the Hoover administration made matters worse. Tariffs were raised to protect American industry from foreign competition. When other countries did the same, world trade virtually collapsed. The Federal Reserve kept interest rates high, shrinking the money supply that could have helped a recovery.
In effect, the Federal Reserve was treating the patient for fever long after the patient had begun to freeze to death. And we had the greatest deflation in American history, about 1/3.
Nearly 9,000 banks failed, taking the hopes of millions of people with them. Not surprisingly, Hoover lost the next election in a landslide. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office in 1933, a desperate nation gave him sweeping powers. 15 million people were unemployed. 500,000 home loans had been foreclosed. Thousands of families had lost their farms. Still, Roosevelt promised the people all would be well.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Roosevelt's answer was the New Deal. And in little more than a year, the New Deal came to Wall Street. Now securities had to be registered with the federal government. Basic disclosures to investors were required. Banks could not take in deposits and underwrite securities, forcing venerable institutions like the Morgan Bank to split into separate entities. And bank deposits were now guaranteed by the new Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. But for Wall Street, the most controversial new change was the creation of the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, to oversee the nation's investment market. FDR figured he could win over Wall Street by appointing one of their own to head the SEC, Joseph P. Kennedy, master stock market player, former bootlegger, and father of a future president.
Kennedy's appointment was criticized because he had been one of the biggest and most important of the Wall Street speculators during the 1920s. I mean, a lot of people thought this was a classic case of putting the fox in charge of henhouse security.
But Kennedy won over most of his critics. He proved to be tough, fair-minded, and a skilled administrator. The SEC was off to a good start. Wall Street's old guard, led by Richard Whitney, the former president of the New York Stock Exchange, thought the government had no business regulating Wall Street. Whitney proved to be a powerful opponent of the SEC.
Richard Whitney was a large man, always immaculately dressed. He lived very well indeed. He had a townhouse in the East 70s. He had a large horse farm out in New Jersey. The only problem was he couldn't afford it.
In the winter of 1937, some irregularities were reported to the New York Stock Exchange.
The truth came out that Richard Whitney was in fact an embezzler. He had been financing his own lifestyle with other people's money. And he had stolen from his clients, from his partners, from his brother, from his wife, from his clubs. He had even stolen from the securities trust fund of the New York Stock Exchange, which paid $20,000 to the widows of brokers. In effect, he was stealing from widows and orphans.
The left-leaning journal, The Nation, looked on in glee.
Wall Street could hardly have been more embarrassed if J.P. Morgan had been caught helping himself from the collection plate at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine.
Whitney was arrested, pled guilty, and was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. Thousands showed up just to see him board the prison train. He would end up serving about 3 years in Sing Sing.
Whitney's disgrace it sharply moved the balance of power away from the old guard, which made it much more of a public institution than it had been before, responsible for a well-regulated market.
The government was now one of the biggest players on Wall Street, bringing order to the market. But once again, America was about to enter a world war. When we come back, Wall Street's surprising role in World War II, and the great bull market of the 50s, how Wall Street came to Main Street. Despite FDR's best efforts, the New Deal did not end the Great Depression. World War II did.
As the U.S. industrial machine met the challenges of war, the economy grew by a staggering 125% between 1940 and 1944. 6,500 naval vessels, almost 300,000 airplanes, 86,000 tanks, 12 million rifles and machine guns, and 47 million tons of artillery shells. But the surging economy did little for Wall Street.
Wall Street did not boom during the Second World War for two reasons. One, it was widely thought that the Western powers might lose the Second World War for a long time. And also, people who had been badly burned in the crash and the subsequent depression weren't all that keen on investing in Wall Street. Business was so bad that brokers on the floor of the exchange would sometimes play baseball with crumpled up quotation sheets for balls and rolled up newspapers for bats.
The problem wasn't a lack of money. Corporate profits were soaring. Unemployment virtually disappeared. Disposable income doubled between 1940 and 45, but Americans did not take their money to Wall Street.
Americans saved enormously during the Second World War because there was so little to buy. And so the American public saving rate was like 37% at the end of the war, but it was mostly invested in insurance, in paying down mortgages, in savings accounts, rather than in stocks and bonds.
The war brought other challenges to Wall Street, if only temporarily.
Well, during World War II, as men went off to war, there was a labor shortage in Wall Street as there were in other industries throughout the country. And for the first time, women worked on the trading floor. They came from jobs in the quotation bureau and worked as carrier pages and as quotation clerks.
As America celebrated the war's end, the economy kept surging.
After the war, people spent. It was people spending on homes, it was people spending on cars, it was people spending on things that a lot of Americans hadn't had, or maybe only had during the 20s and then only on credit and kind of on shaky foundations. But after the war, they went back to it and continued to for decades.
But for Wall Street, the 1940s would not be a repeat of the thrilling bull market of the 1920s. Beneath the surface, however, a far brighter future was developing for Wall Street, thanks in large part to Charles E. Merrill.
Charles Merrill is to the brokerage business what J.P. Morgan was to the banking business. He is the most important broker in Wall Street history. Charlie Merrill formed a brokerage company called Charles E. Merrill and Company in 1914 and soon merged it with the firm of Edmund Lynch.
The firm did well during the 1920s bull market, especially by underwriting chain stores, which were rapidly expanding across the country. By 1928, Merrill sensed disaster. Even though the market was at an all-time high, he thought a terrible downturn was inevitable.
Charlie Merrill began to think that the stock market was too high and it was in a bubble and that it was time to get out. But this was so contrary to popular opinion that he doubted his own analysis and actually went to see a psychiatrist to see if he needed help. And after a few sessions with the psychiatrist, they both decided he didn't need help, and they both started selling out their own portfolios.
During the Depression, Merrill acted as a consultant to the various chain stores that he had helped underwrite. And he had a brainstorm: bring chain store techniques to the brokerage business and create a firm of unprecedented size.
In 1940, Merrill did just that. After a few mergers, the firm was known as Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Bean. Merrill's strategy was simple: bring Wall Street to Main Street.
Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Bean is bringing the financial markets of Wall and LaSalle streets much closer to Main Street, USA.
There isn't any Wall Street. That's just a legend. Wall Street is Montgomery Street in San Francisco, 17th Street in Denver, Marietta Street in Atlanta, Federal Street in Boston, Main Street in Waco, Texas. And it's any spot in Independence, Missouri where thrifty people go to invest their money, to buy and sell securities.
Merrill's ideas were an instant success. By the 1950s, Merrill Lynch was the largest brokerage house on Wall Street. And by the 1960s, it was grossing almost 4 times as much as its biggest competitor. Merrill Lynch was known as the Thundering Herd. But as the 50s started, Wall Street still wasn't doing as well as the overall economy. That would change thanks to new developments that enabled more and more people to own stock indirectly through pension funds and mutual funds. In the 1930s and 40s, large companies had been unionized in unprecedented numbers. And at the bargaining table, unions demanded pension funds for their retired employees. Soon, pension funds with assets totaling billions of dollars were major players on Wall Street. Mutual funds were also coming into their own.
Mutual funds started in the 1920s, and they were appealing to many investors because they took the decision out of what stock to buy and what stock to sell. You left that to professionals who ran the fund.
In 1940, mutual funds had about $500 million in assets. Just a decade later, that had grown to over $2 billion and was quickly climbing. This new money on Wall Street made the long shadow of the 1929 crash begin to fade. At the end of 1954, the Dow finally smashed through the record high of 381.17 that had stood since 1929, a 25-year record. The great bull market took off with a roar.
Eisenhower prosperity was so solid that people became worried about it. And they had the luxury to worry about things like cultural anomie and the blandness of the suburbs. I mean, that's a very prosperous worry to have.
Except for some minor drops, the Dow would go straight up for more than a decade. By the late 1960s, the great changes taking place in America came to Wall Street. In 1967, Muriel Siebert became the first woman to own a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. But the great bull market was stalling out, and Wall Street had another problem. It was literally drowning in paper. It was called the back office crunch.
Things were terrible. We had to close on a Wednesday to clean up our work. Can you imagine closing the stock exchange in the middle of the week for a whole day to allow the brokers to catch up with their paperwork? But in those days, you would see the runners pushing these containers down the street, and they had the physical certificates in it. We don't have physical certificates today. It's all electronic.
Some firms became so backlogged, they simply had to give up and go out of business. $4 billion worth of securities couldn't be accounted for at all.
For Wall Street, it was just a glimpse of what the 70s would bring. But better times were ahead. When we come back, the computer age and the greatest bull market in history. After the turmoil of the late 60s, things got even worse for Wall Street during the 70s. Severe inflation eroded purchasing power, and the Dow fell for more than a decade.
Bad news in America meant bad business on Wall Street.
There wasn't confidence in the American system. The Vietnam War had torn the country apart. There was Woodstock and all that it meant in terms of a generation friction in this country, and it was reflected in Wall Street.
The 1970s for Wall Street were a disaster. The last great bear market was in the 1970s. At its bottom, you could buy a seat on the New York Stock Exchange for $65,000, which was only a little more than twice what it cost to buy a taxi medallion, which is a license to operate a taxi in the streets of Manhattan. It was a miserable time to be on Wall Street. Many people were predicting the end of the street.
At this low point, the institutional investors, the biggest players in the financial markets, decided to throw their weight around. Although the New York Stock Exchange was the biggest game in finance, it wasn't the only one. Smaller exchanges, like the American Stock Exchange, and regional stock markets were happy to cut a deal with the big investors. And in the early 70s, a new player burst on the scene: NASDAQ.
NASDAQ, which stands for the National Association of Securities Dealers Automated Quotation System, was the first electronic network. in that you, instead of having a floor where brokers were physically present to buy and sell stocks, they had a series of TV monitors and keyboards, and you could post what you were willing to buy a stock for or sell it. And then people would type in that they would buy or sell that stock at that price. With the advent of the computer, NASDAQ greatly grew in volume and importance, and it is now although it's not technically a stock exchange at all because it doesn't have a physical existence, it is the second most important stock exchange in the country.
As competition increased, the New York Stock Exchange, with a nudge from the Securities and Exchange Commission, took a radical step. Fixed commissions, one of the cornerstones of the exchange, were abolished. Now, investors could hunt for bargains, negotiating the lowest commission rate to execute a trade.
Well, the consequence actually was an explosion in Wall Street business. It became even more the largest securities market in the world than it had been before.
The microprocessor also transformed the way Wall Street did business. In just a few years, computers shrank from the size of refrigerators to typewriters to notebooks. Just 10 years after the microprocessor arrived, the magnificent interior of the New York Stock Exchange was turned into a giant support system for the electronics that are now the lifeblood of finance.
The computer sped up the whole velocity of all transactions. The finer you can slice it, the more precisely you can get a snapshot of what is going on, then you have an ability, in theory, to profit by these little changes and to act quickly, and that's what people began to do.
As Wall Street was transforming itself, the mood in America was changing as well. Ronald Reagan and Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, decided the sputtering economy needed shock therapy. The Fed raised interest rates to choke off runaway inflation. As borrowing money became more expensive, the country fell into a severe recession. Corporate profits and the Dow plunged. Unemployment went above 10% for the first time since the Great Depression.
In the 80s, you went from a country and from a market where people were no longer worried about things like gas lines, energy crises, shortages. All of a sudden that seemed to vanish, and people were thinking about new ventures, how we could take advantage of it, and how we could just get back to work.
Wall Street also got a boost from an exciting new kind of pension plan, the 401k. It would turn out to be the greatest shift of capital ownership in human history, as employees took responsibility for their own retirement money.
The 401k movement, by necessity, made people pay attention to the stock market. And so it went from being a pariah, from some boring old thing, to being one of the most exciting games in town.
As if making up for lost time, the market of the 1980s took off with a roar, breaking 1,000 in 1982, then climbing 50% in just 3 years to hit 1,500 and soaring to 2,500 by 1987. For the first time since the 1920s, Wall Street had star power.
I think people are always interested in money and who seems to make a lot of it. I don't know that that's particularly good for Wall Street because the figures are both admired and demonized. It's like Satan, only he's really cool.
Two men came to embody this side of 80s Wall Street, Ivan Boesky and Michael Milken.
Ivan Boesky was a crook and psychopathic liar. Unfortunately, he succeeded in ingratiating himself with certain elements in the media who build him up into some great sage, which he wasn't. I don't think he was even a very successful arbitrageur.
As a risk arbitrageur, Boesky made his money by acquiring stock in a company that was a potential takeover target. When the deal came to pass, he could sell at a handsome profit. To improve his odds, Boesky gave suitcases full of cash to bankers and brokers for insider information. That has been illegal since the 1930s. and Boesky was sentenced to 3 years in prison.
Market system requires a degree of fairness, and if some people are making hundreds of millions of dollars from trading on inside information, they're playing with loaded dice.
When Boesky went down, he implicated Michael Milken for violating securities laws as well. The 80s ultimate master of the universe, Milken made hundreds of millions of dollars by helping launch companies like MCI and CNN through high-risk junk bonds. Milken eventually pled guilty to a handful of misdemeanors and received a prison sentence even longer than Boesky's. But 10 years later, the jury is still out on Milken's guilt.
He was a scapegoat, and he was a convenient scapegoat because he made money on a scale which at that time seemed obscene, but today seems commonplace.
I don't really buy that argument. He was a powerful banker who abused his power, and he paid a fine and served some time in prison. A smaller man would do it, so I don't see why Milken shouldn't have done it.
By the summer of 1987, the stock market had other concerns. Interest rates were rising again, and the rising rates on Treasury bonds made stocks look less appealing. Already people were getting uncomfortable with the high-flying stock market. Had it grown too far, too fast? Would it end in a spectacular crash like 1929? By the middle of October, Wall Street got its answer.
A shattering 6.5 hours on Wall Street. The Dow off more than 500 points. Paper losses more than $500 billion. October 19th, 1987. Wall Street's Black Monday. Good evening, I'm Tom Brokaw. Black Monday is now in the books, and the question is, what will happen Tuesday and beyond?
Disbelief. Disbelief was the way the street greeted 50 points? No, 500 points. Now, you must have that wrong. People just couldn't believe it.
There were eerie reminders of the 1929 crash. In '29, the market fell 23% in 2 days. In '87, the market lost nearly as much in 1 day. But comparisons to '29 turned out to be greatly exaggerated.
Well, today we hardly think at all about the crash of 1987 because it had no long-term consequences, unlike the crash of 1929. I mean, the Federal Reserve did what it was supposed to do, which was provide liquidity, and the market recovered within about a year and a half.
The 1987 crash is ancient memory now. You find old 35-year-olds who are telling their whippersnapper colleagues, look, I was here in '87. You haven't seen anything.
Wall Street's quick recovery even managed to overturn a long-standing pattern. Usually, bad decades follow good ones. But after the huge gains of the 80s, the market just kept getting stronger.
But basically, the market has been rising since 1982, and that is the greatest bull market in history.
Today, as we enter a new century, there is a wild card in the great game: the internet and the revolution in communications.
Now you're seeing the internet trading. We're going to see global investing. It's going to be just as easy to buy a German stock as it is to buy an American stock within a year or two.
But Wall Street's past has lessons for the future.
We had the computer boom, the first computer boom around the early 70s. Except for IBM, every one of those companies that was touted and blown up to high proportions isn't around anymore.
Every day, the landscape of finance is changing in the most profound transformation Wall Street has ever seen. Online trading, day trading, enormous fortunes won and lost in internet stocks, and electronic communications networks, stock exchanges that exist only in cyberspace. These developments unfolding around us are the next chapter in the story of the Great Game. Time magazine made this observation at the end of the millennium.
Every time a seismic shift takes place in our economy, there are people who feel the vibrations long before the rest of us do. Ferry owner Cornelius Vanderbilt jumped ship when he saw the railroads coming. Thomas Watson Jr., overwhelmed by his sense that computers would be everywhere even when they were nowhere, bet his father's office machine company on it, IBM. It's easy to sit here today nodding about the power of electrified commerce. But back in the day when frankly, when everyone was poo-pooing the idea of online sales, there were a few folks who believed.
The Wall Street of 25 years ago will not exist 10 years from now. I wonder if there'll even be a floor to the New York Stock Exchange anymore. Will it not all take place in the ether? I mean, just like NASDAQ does today. And I rather suspect it will. I think the broker is maybe an endangered species in that you no longer need the broker to execute a trade. You can do that yourself sitting at your keyboard.
What is certain is that the game will go on. Buying, selling, making money, and losing it are all part of the very human urge we have to trade with each other. The rules may change, but human nature does not. And we will all continue to be fascinated by the great game. For CNBC, I'm Sue Herrera.
To order a personal VHS copy of The Great Game, The Story of Wall Street, call 1-800-777-8398. The cost is $20, plus $5 for shipping and handling. Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and personal checks are accepted. Please allow 2 to 4 weeks for delivery. The Great Game.